Hello and welcome to a CJS Colloquium. I am Junko Habu, the chair of the Center for Japanese Studies and professor of anthropology, and I am the host of today's event. Today's colloquium is titled The Legacy of Ezra Vogel's Work, 60 Years After Japan's New Middle Class. As many of you know, Professor Ezra Vogel at Harvard University was an eminent scholar of East Asian studies, including Japanese studies. His writings about modern politics and society in East Asia, including Japan as #1, were widely read by scholars as well as the general public, and his writings had strong impacts on our understanding of sociopolitical changes in Japan, China, and beyond. So many of us at UC Berkeley benefited from Professor Vogel's scholarship over the years, and we were really sad when we learned of his passing in December 2020. This is especially because our university would have had the honor of hosting his talk in spring 2020, but the pandemic situation did not allow us to do so. When we heard the extremely sad news last December, we were actually in the middle of our attempts to finalize the rescheduling of the postponed event. So after talking to Stephen Vogel of the Department of Political Science, a son of Ezra and a member of our CJS Executive Committee, we felt that one way to celebrate Professor Ezra Vogel's contributions to the field of Japanese studies would be to highlight the importance of Ezra's early work, Japan's New Middle Class, in the history of US scholarship on Japanese society. Today, we are delighted to welcome Professor Amy Borovoy of Princeton University, Professor Mary White of Boston University, and Professor Allison Alexy of University of Michigan to commemorate the contribution of Professor Ezra Vogel's work to the field of Japanese studies. Professor Amy Borovoy is a cultural anthropologist who is interested in the ethics of care and social democracy in modern Japan. Her work explores the ways in which the family has served as a surrogate for the state and public health regimes. She will present the results of her current research, and her talk is titled Japan's New Middle Class in Post-War Social Thought and its Continuing Relevance. Professor Borovoy's keynote speech will be followed by presentations of two prominent scholars. Our first discussant is Professor Mary White of the Department of Anthropology, Boston University, who was one of the early students of Ezra Vogel. She has a very productive scholarly career covering many facets of Japanese society, including urban Japan, who studies tourism, family and elderly and social change in Japan. Our second discussant is Professor Allison Alexy of the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, University of Michigan. She's a cultural anthropologist with a focus on contemporary Japan through the lens of family life. And her ethnographic research investigates changing norms for romantic relationships and legal constructions of intimacy contextualized within the rapid societal changes in recent decades. As an anthropologist, I hope that these discussions will highlight various aspects of Professor Vogel's scholarship and help us think about the new directions in Japanese studies. And you can submit questions at any point during the talk using the chat function. Please do not use the Q&A function, and please use the chat function. So please welcome Professor Amy Borovoy, and her talk is titled Japan's New Middle Class in Post-War Social Thought and its Continuing Relevance.
Thank you very much, Junko, for that nice introduction. And It's really a pleasure and an honor to be asked to come together with everyone to reflect on and commemorate the work of Ezra Vogel since his unfortunate and unexpected passing in December of 2020. It's really a pleasure too to come together with my colleagues Mary White and Allison Alexy, whose company and comments I'm very much looking forward to this evening. And I suspect that there are many of Ezra's students, dear friends, and colleagues in the audience this afternoon or this evening, and also perhaps even some family members, which is really wonderful. I was not fortunate enough to count myself among one of Ezra's students or close colleagues, although I did have many conversations with Ezra throughout the course of my career. I used to bump into him frequently at the International House of Japan, where we both spent often a couple of weeks in the early part of summer. And he would, always hail me. We would sit and talk. He would invite me over to his table or introduce me to the person he was having breakfast with. And I also had the opportunity to sit down and interview him in a more sustained way. I think that was actually the first time I sat down with him, which was in April 2011. So his work has become very relevant to me, particularly Japan's new middle class, in the manuscript that I'm currently writing, which is provisionally titled A Living Laboratory, Japan Studies in Post-War Social Thought. And I wanted to share just a few reflections today of a few thoughts, ways that I've come to make sense of the sort of magnitude of that book. So one of the puzzles that I think confronts us when we think about and write about the text Japan's New Middle Class is that there's this kind of time warp, I think, that occurs. It's very easy to imagine the book as a book about the miracle of economic growth in Japan, or about Japan Inc., that, sort of massive middle class that we imagine that in actuality is closer to Japan in the late 1970s or perhaps 1980s than it was to the Japan that Ezra and Suzanne researched at the end of the 1950s. I think we have a tendency to view the book that way, partly because in some ways the observations in the book are just so spot on. The Vogels did such intense and close observation with so much care that they were able to detail and document many aspects of post-war society that we have come to associate with the ensuing decades, the latter part of the 20th century, including the emerging system of corporate welfare, social welfare, the meritocracy of the exam system, the focus on cultivating human capital, the gender division of labor, and so forth. But I just want to remember that when Ezra and Suzanne were doing their first stint of research in Japan between 1958 and 1960, Japan really was post-war. And if we use the terminology of historian Andrew Gordon at Harvard University, it was really kind of in the end stages of what we might call trans-war, what he calls trans-war, which is a period that started before the war. Japan was still really transitioning out of the war. If I just go back to my original photo, the photo that was also in the announcement for the event, a number of the women at the table are wearing kimonos. There was still poverty in Japan. Mamachi did not yet, I believe, have flush toilets. I think William Kelly noted that in his introduction to the third edition of the book. Japan had not yet hosted the Tokyo Olympics in 1964. And the country was still experiencing the effects of the devastation of the war. So it was really before this era of kind of the mass middle class, the Ichiokuso Churyu, that we came to associate with Japan in the 1960s and 1970s. And in the book, Ezra very much sets the scene in that way. He tells us from the beginning that Japan is a nation that is still confronting the crisis of the war. From a nation that only 100 years ago was voluntarily isolated from the developments of the rest of the world, Japan has become an important member of the international community. This is in the opening passages of the book. The Japanese people in this century have adjusted not only to these fundamental changes, but to a series of natural disasters and national crises. The contemporary Japanese adult has faced a staggering number of difficulties. The standard of living, which was rising in the 1920s, was disrupted first by a terrible earthquake and later by the devastating effects of a world depression. The increasing political freedom in the 1920s was gradually stifled by an oppressive military rule, which required increasingly severe sacrifices until the end of World War II. During the war, many small children were separated from their parents and sent to rural areas to escape air raids, and many families had their own wage earner killed. After the fighting, many families already undernourished provided for relatives who returned from the military or the overseas colonies. Not only did they live with severe shortages of food, clothing, and shelter, but they had to renounce their former leaders and traditions and accept new patterns of life imposed by the victors. So the stage is set in this kind of immediate post-war period. The book was really not about Japan Inc. And to sort of imagine that way is a kind of anachronistic contortion of history. It was really a time when the idea that Japan would emerge as a world economic leader or as a threat, as an economic threat to the United States was probably something that few people had considered or could imagine. In fact, most researchers who were working on Japan were working on rural Japan. And in fact, one of the early academic monographs to be published about Japanese communities was Village Japan, which was published in 1958. So just at the time the Vogels were beginning their research. And Ronald Dorr had published City Life in Japan in 1958, but that was a very early work to deal with the urban world. And I know from conversations with anthropologist David Plath, for example, it was actually difficult to get money, grant money to study urban communities in Japan. So it was a very different time. And also, according to Ezra's own telling of the story, he did not set out to study Japan's new middle class. In fact, he wasn't necessarily setting out to study Japan. He was interested in the family, and it was the family that led him to study Japan, not the reverse. He had worked with William Caudle, who studied psychiatry and mental health in Japan, and his advisor or his mentor, Florence Clacon, with whom he was working, I believe, as a research assistant, told him, and these are Ezra's words, that he needed to have a comparative case. So Ezra told me, I got to Japan because I'd worked on mental health. Florence Clacon told me that I needed to do comparative work, and Bill Caudle said, why don't you do Japan? And I think it was after he got to Japan, his plan was to study families in comparison, particularly families dealing with children wrestling with mental health issues, that he began to sort of formulate this project of kind of broadening out from the family and expanding to talk about this broader social, socioeconomic phenomenon of the new middle class. So the notion of sort of this as a study of Japan Inc. is anachronistic. And in a way, it's even anachronistic to think of this as the defining study of the salary man. I really think of it instead as a kind of comparative study of modernity, which was focusing on the family. And in that sense, it was really not about Japan's uniqueness either, since modernity was understood to be a shared phenomenon, potentially universal. And I want to talk more about that later. So the idea of Japan as a model or mirror was very far off in the future, perhaps even unthinkable. And it's interesting that when I interviewed Ezra in April of 2011, he also told me, I asked him a little bit at the end of the interview about Japan is number one. Um, and, I asked him, was that a book that came out of the sort of post-Vietnam moment of Americans finally beginning to experience a kind of sense of humility around their own influence and around their own society? And he told me he didn't think it was, because he said he felt that book was early. And he reminded me that Japan is number one was published in 1979, and that was before the trade wars between Japan and the United States really heated up, and that people weren't saying those kinds of things about Japan in 1979. As Ezra put it to me around his, breakfast table in his Cambridge house, Americans didn't think they had to learn from anyone. So, in a sense, what I think about both Japan's new middle class and Japan is number one, which I won't have too much to say about today, is that they were both early. And the other thing that I wanted to say about Japan's new middle class, just before I move on, is that it was really the opposite of a polemical kind of book. It was a quiet, kind of, in some ways understated, rigorously committed work of empirical observation, born of intensive interviews and deep immersion. And I think, one of the things that's striking as I look at the photographs that Steve Vogel has kindly shared with me of the Vogels as they're doing research in Japan is just their deep sense of immersion, their comfort, their trust with their informants, who I know that in some cases they cultivated relationships with that lasted for several more decades. And when I teach my students about participant observation, and any textbook that you read about how to do good participant observation involves cultivating trust and cultivating rapport with your interlocutors. And it's very clear that they did that in a very thoroughgoing and sophisticated way. So what I want to do now is talk about sort of what I see as this kind of experiment that played out as Americans were observing Japan in the decades after the war. I see the book, as I said, as a kind of comparative study of modernity, and it's a study that is kind of unfolding in real time as the Vogels are observing it. This was a time, as I think many people here today know, that Americans were keenly interested in the questions of modernity and modernization in the United States and around the world. Modernization was a key conversation in the social sciences, and there was a lot at stake in that conversation. Attached to the concept of modernization was the notion of democracy and democratization, anti-fascism, human fulfillment and the good life, post-authoritarianism and post-traditionalism, human freedom and the realization of the individual. And Japan was a fascinating project, I think, for Americans to observe in their study of modernity and modernization. It was a laboratory that was unfolding before their eyes, and it was a particularly American project. The United States had occupied Japan from 1945 to 1952, and unlike the German occupation of Germany, for example, it was really an American-led occupation. There was a considerable amount of interest and I think pride and excitement about Japan's achievements and transformations during the occupation. And at the same time, American scholars were beginning to build library collections. Area studies programs were just getting going. The Okayama Field Station, founded by the University of Michigan Center for Japan Studies, opened in 1950, and the Crown Prince of Japan came to visit Ann Arbor. These kinds of transformations, including, of course, the passage of Japan's new constitution, the Crown Prince marrying a commoner, et cetera, I think were very exciting to Americans. And there was a sense, and I think kind of a a hope that Japan would kind of march along this shared path, and Americans would guide Japan along, and that we could expect to see certain kinds of social transformation there. So I just want to give a little bit of a sense of what this discourse looked like. Now, this is from one of the Princeton University Press studies of modernization in Japan. The book was actually published in 1965, so after Japan's New Middle Class, but it's a publication, I'm sure many people in the room know the book, publication of essays that were collected, that were originally delivered at the Hakone Conference in 1960. So the editor was Marius Jansson, but in some of the early essays, John Hall, historian John Hall, and others sort of map out what they are seeing as kind of the programmatic statement about what modernization will mean. And they talk about this notion of social modernization. This is largely kind of pooled together, I think, from various other social science texts, largely Talkit Parsons, that modernization will mean moving away from particularistic bonds of family and local community to universalistic and impartial systems of rules. It will mean leaving behind the influence of extended kin and patriarchy and achieving upward mobility through merit. A lessening tendency for individuals to identify their interests with and feel loyalty towards small face-to-face groups such as the family, with consequently a growing tendency for individualism, individuation and identification, larger impersonal groups such as political party, interest-based groups, etc. So the key words in this kind of sort of thesis of what would happen to nations as they modernize is this idea of kind of individualization and moving away from feudalistic forms of hierarchy, group pressure, the tyranny of extended kin and the rural village, and the kind of emergence of the individual as this self-made free actor who kind of solidifies themselves psychologically too as resistant to group pressure and so forth. So I want to say that I think it's appropriate in some ways to locate Japan's new middle class in the context of this conversation. Ezra received his PhD in 1958. I believe his dissertation advisor was Talkit Parsons, and Ezra himself has spoken about the influence of Parsons on his work. Parsons was, as we know, a major figure in thinking about these issues of modernization at Harvard. He published The Structure of Social Action in 1949, and he published Towards a General Theory of Social Action in 1951. And he was very much a scholar whose agenda was to kind of make sense of what these post-traditional, post-aristocratic, post-feudal societies would look like, and what would be the foundations for their social order. And in order to explain that, he came up with this kind of mechanistic, schematic sort of structure, which he proposed would explain how these societies how societies reproduce themselves in the absence of these kind of traditional codes, or in the absence of coercive or authoritarian forms of rule. And the systems that he described, sorry about that, were, he talked about 4 subsystems. One was the economy. Second was the political system. Third was family and education. And fourth was the law, beliefs, values, ideology, etc. And each of these 4 subsystems occupied a kind of role in sustaining and reproducing social order. So the role of the economy was what Parsons called adaptation. So adaptation to the environment through labor, production, allocation, and so forth. The political system filled the role of goal attainment by determining social goals and mobilizing resources for their achievement. Family and education perform the role of integration, integrating individuals into social groups. And the law, beliefs, and values brought about what Parsons called latency, renewing social values and motivation through law and morality. Well, and Parsons called this adaptation, goal attainment, integration, latency. There was an acronym, AGIL, AGIL, which got tossed around a lot as a kind of shorthand for this system. So it's interesting that if you look at Japan's new middle class and you look at the table of contents, you see that actually the structure of the book quite closely mirrors Parsons' subsystems. There are chapters, the focus, the breakdown of the book falls out along these lines. So we could argue that the significance of salary is a chapter about economics, the bureaucratic setting, politics, gateway to salary and the family. A gateway to salary is of course the incredible chapter in Japan's new middle class about the examination system, and the family is integration. And the chapters on basic values, community values, etc., deal with issues of ideology. So when I first realized this, I had like this kind of profound aha moment, which I've tried to capture here on my PowerPoint, because I realized, wow, you know, this book is really very much a kind of expression of this historical moment, this set of concerns. And of course, to some extent, it really is. I mean, Ezra himself described it that way. And, you know, this sort of discussion of leaving a society of kind of peer-based, hierarchical, patriarchal pressure and moving into something that's more rationalized is exactly the kind of story that he's telling. The story of moving from like small family firms to rationalized system of salary is very much that narrative of rationalization, the urbanization of Japanese families moving from the country into the city to seek a salary and thereby become independent from their dozoku and, you know, rural extended kin is very much a story of self-making. Of course, the Gateway to Salary chapter, all about the meritocracy of the examination. So in some ways, Japan's new middle class is very much a Parsonian analysis. And of course, focus on the family too really captures or expresses Parsons' own interests. But as I thought more about the book and just, you know, kind of tried to reconcile this aha moment I was having with the influence of Parsons to what I have always kind of observed and taken away from the book, I began to really think that it's all the more powerful that, in a sense, what I feel the Vogels, Ezra, and Suzanne doing in Japan's new middle class is also very much telling a different story from the Parsonian story. And I think that's really a significant break that speaks to the powerful contributions of the book and the way in which it was extraordinarily original and I think unexpected. And I believe began, you know, sowed the seeds in some way for a conversation about Japan's modernity that would look very different, that would break away from some of these truisms that Americans were expecting to see and kind of begin to provide a language to carve out a discourse for thinking about, I guess, what I might loosely call a non-individualistic, perhaps non-American modernity. So let me just say a little bit about what I mean by that. In the Vogel's analysis, society is a very powerful force. Ezra and Suzanne talk a lot about social groups, not individualism. They talk about the weight of the social group on the actions of the individual and the mentality of the individual. They talk about the powerful influence of social institutions on the individual as forms of social welfare. The company, as they describe it in the book, shapes all aspects of a salaryman's life, including his social life and his friends. Men are heavily indebted to their company and feel a strong sense of loyalty. Their livelihood is invested in this one institution, and the livelihood of their entire family is as well. Obligations to the company precipitate numerous social exchanges beyond simply the boundaries of everyday labor. The family, too, is strongly powerful in shaping individuals and shaping the transmission of social capital. We see in the context of the family the importance of intergenerational transmission of human capital and the continuing influence of the family on social class and social status in ways that extend into a young person's adulthood. Similarly with the school defines social status. The entrance examination procedure is all-consuming. Teachers play a large role in students' lives, and the presence of the school is large in students' and families' lives. The neighborhood also occupies a similarly powerful place. And Ezra and Suzanne talk about entrance into the neighborhood as carefully ceremonialized. In the book, I meant to show this just as a way to kind of ease away from Talkit Parsons and simply make my point that in the end, although Japan's new middle class is very much a Parsonian book, I see what the Vogels doing is something that's interestingly very different. I won't read through all these, but there's a considerable amount of work in Japan's new middle class to sort of talk about these groups and how they shape the individual. And in the text, Ezra writes about the narrow world of the individual in Japan and how strongly one institution can shape the life of any given individual, and how people tend to be surrounded by one dominant social group. He writes, Ezra writes, perhaps the most striking characteristic of Japanese society is the existence of a series of tightly knit groups connected by a controlled and limited amount of movement. So he talks about, the father and his company gang, the pressure a father will feel to maintain social relationships with colleagues, precisely because so much is at stake in his relationship to the company. People spend so much time together, minor differences of opinion can create tensions. So going out together and socializing becomes all the more important. He talks about the mother and her neighborhood. When a wife first moves into the neighborhood, she makes the rounds, muko sangen ryo donari, carrying a small wrapped parcel. The wife is expected to devote herself completely to home, and once the children are born, to children. So in a sense, for a mother, it's really her family and her neighborhood community, but mainly the family that are all defining. And for the child, it is school. What I think is striking about these discussions in Japan's new middle class, which consume a large portion of their analysis, is in the end this idea that what we're seeing in Japan emerging in the late 1950s is something that feels very different from what American social scientists, including Talkit Parsons, expected to find. And there are moments in the book when Ezra really puts his finger on that. And this is one moment. The former statements of Confucian and Shinto ideology, this is from the chapter called Basic Values. The former statements of Confucian and Shinto ideology, though widely accepted before the war, are now so closely identified with the feudalistic past and tainted by association with the militarism and super patriotism of World War II that today few Mamachi residents can accept them without serious modification. Few believe, for example, that the husband should sacrifice his family in order to serve his superior. On the other hand, many Mamachi residents believe that although democracy and individualism might help point the way to a new value system, they often are only a justification for selfishness and therefore not a solid basis for morality. They cannot admire, for example, a philosophy that permits an individual to look out for himself, even if it means neglecting aged parents. In the end, I believe that in Japan's new middle class, the Vogels had actually journeyed a long way from modernization theory in many respects. And they seem to suggest that Mamachi residents, although they had escaped one form of social control, namely the social control of the dozoku, the emperor system, the pre-war social pressures of patriarchal family companies and so forth, the tyranny of the mother-in-law for a young mother, they had entered into new forms of social control and social pressure. And that was the pressure of the urban communities, the pressures of the exam system, the pressures of corporate employment, and kind of the heavy hand of social control that emerged in those settings. A number of analyses that followed in the 1960s, 70s, into the 80s continued to kind of give a language for this notion that Ezra and Suzanne had kind of floated out of this society oriented around particular social locales. Ronald Dorr spoke about the stakeholder society with respect to the company, the stakeholder versus the shareholder company, and a company where people commit to the long term and in return are cared for, and that there's a kind of social contract there that involves some burdens on the part of the employee. Tom Rolene spoke about the notion of spiritual education. With respect to gender, Mary White has spoken about the culture of separate spheres. And also in the context of spheres of education, Mary White, Lois Peake, and others have talked about the profound kinds of social control and deep socialization that children experience in the context of schools. And Mary Brinton has spoken very powerfully about the cultivation of human capital and why that's so important to the transmission of wealth and status in Japan. I think there's a really interesting story here that I trace in my book manuscript, but that I won't go into at length now, that there was a moment in the 50s and 60s where there were kind of simultaneous, multiple and in some ways conflicting interests in the world of social thought and social theory. And I think about Japan's new middle class in the context of the real interest in the question of the emerging white-collar social class in American sociology at that time. And many of these texts that I've reproduced here were precisely concerned with this question of modernization and also embraced the Parsonian and Weberian framework of rationalization and disenchantment. But in reading some of these texts more closely, what one realizes is that even though, for example, if we think about David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd, it is in part a kind of lamentation that in the world of mass society, mass media, mass consumption, and mass production, Americans have they've lost their inner compass, they've lost their way, they've lost their sort of moral capacity to stand up to the pressures of society. So The Lonely Crowd is in many ways, as Jamie Cohen Cole and others have remarked, a kind of Cold War book, which values the presence of the kind of solidified individualism that we think of as a hallmark of American social theory at this time. But David Reisman is also very concerned with community. He's concerned with what we might talk about today as kind of communitarianism. For him, the mass mediated society is a society of loss because it's also blacked out a sense of social mores. It's displaced the father as a role model and a disciplinary figure, a figure of respect and authority in the home, because men are leaving the home now to commute to the office, so they're no longer present for their children. He talks about school as a sphere of morale, a sphere which instills morale rather than morality. So he's also very concerned with what's happening in the United States, not just as a failure of individualism, but also as a failure of kind of social community and social authority. I think there are many messages like this when we think about the kind of predicament that faced Americans in the 1950s and 60s, trying to imagine what modern society would look like after World War II, with the threat of communism and authoritarianism, but still not quite willing to let go with some idea of society or community. And one of the things I'm really interested in my manuscript is thinking about how the emergence of Japan, with its kind of interestingly different modernity, gave voice to some way of imagining alternatives. Now, I don't necessarily think those were always perfect alternatives. In fact, I think they were problematic in many instances. And I wouldn't necessarily say, too, that this problem of the social or social community was what most preoccupied Ezra Vogel and Suzanne Vogel when they were conducting this research. But it is significant to me, and I take it to be one of the major contributions of the text, that they were able to give a language to and kind of speak back to this very dominant notion of modernization as individualization, and show how this was taking place very differently in a place that everyone was watching, which was Japan. So before I close, I want to just make two very brief comments about the continuing significance of the book. And I think that these is really just very provisional food for thought, because I think there are probably many people, including Mary White and Allison Alexy, who have thoughts about this book's continuing significance. So let me just float out two very brief ideas before I wrap up. And I'm realizing now that unfortunately I revised my presentation, but I seem to have the second to last version. So I'm going to roll with that. So here is one aspect of how I think about the continuing significance of the book. So I happened to be reading this article that was published in the Asahi Digital, which was an interview with Andrew Gordon from Harvard University just a couple of weeks ago, that my colleague Jim Ramo actually called my attention to. And it was just interesting as kind of a reflection on, in some ways, how far Japan is from this very kind of exciting and promising moment that Ezra and Suzanne were observing in the late 1950s, in that we've now had 2 decades of very slow economic growth. Japan actually shows relatively high rates of poverty, certainly compared to what it did before, but even compared to other wealthy industrialized nations. There's a lot of discourse around sort of the kakusa shakai, the fragmentation of the middle class. Obviously, we're in a very different moment now. And Andrew Gordon had a lot of really thoughtful things to say about this in the interview. And he talks about sort of the reality of the Ichiokuso Churyu of the 1960s, that felt very real, and that there was a very real socioeconomic basis for that idea, that the composition of students at public universities actually mirrored the composition of the income brackets of the population at large, including the lower income brackets and so forth. And he also talks about now the ways in which the society has fragmented, the growing amount of poverty. He comments that, it might not be as bad as it seems because, for example, the elderly may look poorer than they are because they have no income, and yet but the fact is they do have savings. We have more people working part-time. More people are counted as working part-time than they used to be. Women who are doing piecework at home or something like that might not have been on the books before, whereas now they are. So we may have somewhat exaggerated sense of the extent to which things are falling apart. But what this provoked me to reflect is that Ezra's analysis really set us up in some ways to understand what's happening now, or at least it provided some kind of foundation, because the book really starts with Ezra's reflection that the corporate welfare is a social welfare problem in Japan, and that the beginning passages of the book comment on how stingy the Japanese welfare state was in this post-war moment, something which I think has not changed a considerable amount. And that it's really the companies who have stepped in to provide social stability and social security for Japanese middle-class families. Without that, they would have a tough time. Asking for money from the government is time consuming and it's humiliating, and there isn't a lot of money that comes. And I think that what we're seeing is very much the consequences of that as the corporate welfare safety net frays a little bit, and as more people are working in temporary or part-time positions, we are seeing the after effects of the kind of fragmentation of the welfare system that he defined. So I often think about how he framed the entire book, and I think it continues to be informative. So the last thing I want to say in terms of significance is just to reflect a little bit on Suzanne Vogel's contributions to this book, which I also think continue to ramify in hugely significant and relevant ways, and ways that I think about often in my own work, and I know that Mary Corky and Allison do as well. So as many of you know, Suzanne became an independent researcher and scholar in her own right after Japan's New Middle Class was published in the early 1960s. She went on to publish her independent study called Professional Housewife, The Career of Urban Middle Class Japanese Women, a text that's been influential to many of us. It was published first as an independent study with the Radcliffe Institute, and then was published in 1976 with Radcliffe, and then 1978 in the Japan Interpreter. She used her own background and professional training in psychiatric social work to become a researcher and scholar. And in 1988 and 89, she got a Fulbright scholarship to return to Japan to study women and comparative psychology. She contributed a new chapter to the next edition of Japan's New Middle Class, Beyond Success, Mamachi 30 years later. And for let me think about this, 20 years, she worked as a psychiatric social worker and a consultant for about 4 to 8 weeks a year at the Hasegawa Byoin, where I know she was a beloved mentor and colleague. Her insights in Professional Housewife were so provocative and so really pioneering. Mary White has taken those insights and developed essays later, which also really informed my own thought, Home Truths and the Virtue of Japanese Housewives. And I want to say that with respect to Suzanne's work, this notion of the professional housewife was so counterintuitive. I think it was really kind of fascinating. Again, she published this in 1976. Remember that many Americans at that time were still kind of enthralled with second wave feminism in the United States, and this sort of Betty Friedan idea that women's liberation meant leaving the home and earning a wage. And Suzanne was able to convey first a certain history of the public nature of women's role and the way they saw their contribution as socially important and the pride they had. which was really significant. I know that her work was controversial among some Japanese feminists, but I think it also really helps us understand where we are today. And with Japan, as I see it, sort of caught in this really problematic trap that so many aspects of Japanese society, the way in which it functions, men's ability to labor so intensively, the transmission of human capital through the exam system, elderly care, community activities, public health, all the things that Japanese women contribute to Japanese society and are able to contribute partly because many of them work part-time, are sort of bumping up against the fact that in Japan, we're seeing an emerging labor shortage and also the decline of total fertility. There's a complete kind of double bind there that if we want women to work more or have more children, they won't be able to do all those things at once. And the fact that I think they haven't been able to let go of some of the roles that Suzanne originally sort of identified as being important to them and important to the society more broadly has really created this kind of interesting predicament where it feels like any one piece that's removed will, in a sense, crumble the system. So I also, in my final version, I had a picture of Suzanne consulting with her colleagues at the Hasegawa Hospital, but I don't think I have that in this version. So I'll have to leave it to people's imagination. But in conclusion, I want to hand the floor over to Corky and Allison. I want to say that I think of Japan's new middle class as an understated yet devastatingly thorough and precise text that we cannot think without, particularly in Japan studies, and which continues to give us much food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was a very informative talk, and made me think of a lot of issues that I experienced. I was born in 1959, so it's a little bit later than what's written in the book. But I really feel that some of the discussion that you talked about is really relevant. And I have lots of questions, but for now we are moving on to our two prominent scholars' comments. And first, I'd like to ask Professor Mary White for her presentation.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Oh, great. Thank you, Junko. Thank you, Amy. Thank you for all the colleagues and friends who are present here. It's almost like one of Ezra's Kenkyukai right here. And perhaps, Amy, you will have launched the next generation of Kenkyukai in Ezra's mode. By the way, I can't wait for your book to come out. That's going to spur a lot of discussion. The other day, I was searching around for something and I found a stack of big old spiral-bound notebooks. I don't know if you can see this. These are very old. They were very obviously old because they only cost 49 cents, I see. And they were from the early 1960s and from the early 1970s. The first ones were from classes I took from John Pelzel, Harvard's Japan anthropologist in those days. And the second set from Ezra's classes. One was from his class on communist China, and this one from a graduate reading class on Japan that he taught. So I've been thinking about today's event and wondering what to say, but then opening these notebooks reminded me of those two most influential books, and Amy has mentioned already, of course, Japan's New Middle Class, but before that, Ron Doerr's City Life in Japan, 1958. So in my notebook, I see that Ezra assigned me in 1973 to present to the class those very two books. and I see my notes on them, which is uncanny. I'd go back to those, but I really, Amy, your deft extraction of what was and still is important about Japan's new middle class is really stunning. Yeah, and it is still on my syllabus too. I've been asked, though, particularly to include my experiences of Ezra as a teacher. So I'm going to weave the book around those as well. And I will, and the role of the book today too. When Rondor's and Ezra's books both first appeared, as Amy pointed out, most studies of Japan were rural, were village studies, such as Suyemura from 1939 and Smith's Nakahara, Norbeck's Takashima, many, many more, and Dorr himself in Shinohata. Villages were seen as compact and coherent and mappable in social and political and economic terms. And cities seemed changing and chaotic and difficult to grasp, hard to see patterns of culture, best avoided because they also might be contaminated by Western influences. So agrarian Japan seemed to be core Japan. I wasn't interested in villages myself. I wanted city life because it was something I thought I knew, and because there were always cafes, which were my homes in Harvard Square as well. And I liked complexity, I liked variation, and I liked the promise of the lack of orthodoxy I thought I would find in Japanese cities, and which Dorr embraced too, as he permitted contradictions in both Yamanote and Shitamachi in the place he called Shitayama, combining the features of both. It's possible I feared being in an intimate, claustrophobic, everyone knows your name, tightly knit village. At the same time, the romance of borrowed nostalgia for the Furusato, then beginning to appear in heavily urbanized Japan, had its allure as well. But I could find that kind of community in Shitamachi, as well as in a remote rice-growing village. And everyone in Yanaka knows everyone else's business, as you know. But Ezra's book was not cited in Shitamachi, but in suburban Tokyo, in Chiba, in families. And here, I'm going to go back to that spiral-bound notebook from 1973, from my assigned presentation. Can you imagine having to pronounce on your sensei's book in front of him? Well, the family stories I found then, as Amy recounted, of Ezra's sojourn to the separation of spheres of responsibility and activity between men and women, the growing importance of the mother as school adjunct or home coach, the intensification of relationships within a nuclear household. These are now interesting as aspects of a moment, and interesting then, and as Amy pointed out, it was ahead of its time in some ways, but it was also not depicting what people thought it was going to be. I think that disjunction you described is exactly right. Ezra noticed lots of interesting detail. He noticed the creeping cooperation of husbands in child rearing and household tasks, as did Dorr earlier. But he explained it through the lack of personnel in a nuclear family to do the many tasks of the home, not through a change in family culture or a change in men's attitudes. I see that my marginal notes were focused on change in urban neighborhoods, and I wasn't very far from those moments that were described actually in either book, having come to Japan myself first in 1963. This is what Amy points out, as Andy said, the trans war, yes, and dirt roads and daikon patches in central Tokyo, I witnessed myself, and finding myself enlisted with a hachimaki and a festival jacket, carrying the mikoshi in a local matsuri on parade as a gaijin. I saw trade and craft and shop families where, as in Jill Kleinberg's phrase, work and family are almost one. But more often I saw Sarariman families where the story was of the absent husband who became the Sunday friend to his children. So my notebook comments in 73, 10 years after my first trip to Japan, reflect the perceptions in both books, that things were changing, that old verities might not hold, and yet with much descriptive detail, showing you that what is really is the experience both of plurality and continuity, that Benedict's patterns of cultures needed complicating, that acceptable contradiction was part of the perpetuation of things along with the introduction of things. Much later, I wrote a book about how the lived version of family life deviated far from the official one and far from the expectations of social services and policy. The fiction of homogeneity and adherence to accepted behavior could not be maintained. The ways in which both Rondor and Ezra both demonstrated this was to discuss personality, individuality, and to show what was happening in the social forces that influenced them. The multi-sensory observations of both books, Amy pointed out how detailed Ezra's book is. The sounds of the yakiimo vendor, the smell of oden, the sights of the back alleys. I always tell my students to read the footnotes. Both Ron and Ezra sometimes hid very juicy stuff in the notes. The most popular footnote in Japan's new middle class is, as everyone knows, on page 220, about sexual practices between husbands and wives. Nowadays, that would be a whole chapter, up front and with first-person statements about practice and prowess. But that it was a footnote speaks volumes. For me, as for Ezra and Suzanne, the detail was everything. When I was asked by a sociologist much later what theory informed my work, he noticed my hesitation and said accusingly, "Aha." Well, I did come up with something, but I don't remember what I said. Basically, the lesson I'd learned from Ezra was to look for what makes the data sing. And the song might not resemble established theory, even that of Talkit Parsons, and it might even be a better song than if it did. Ezra's work and the conjunctions with my own are many, but I think I should add some real life moments since I've been asked to show the history of the relationship. This goes really far back because I came to Harvard before Ezra did. I came as a freshman in 1959, already interested in Japan. But I was then told, if you're interested in Japan, you must concentrate in anthropology, the study of pre-modern societies. As Japan was in post-war reconstruction, or maybe the trends post-war, and scarcely yet to be seen as modern. As my undergraduate years at Harvard were spent studying Japan without having gone there, because Harvard in those days did not value semesters or years abroad, I mostly studied Japan through the colorfully related experiences of John Pelzel, who served in the occupation. Taking some years out, however, before I went back to graduate school, I returned to continue work on Japan in the early 1970s. Now I was advised, take your study of Japan to sociology, the study of modern societies, and where Japan now was seen to fit since it had experienced the economic miracle. So of course I trotted off to sociology, and Ezra had arrived at Harvard, so there I was. A story of the disciplines, maybe a story of Harvard, but now, of course, anthropology is happily open to urban studies and modernity, and I'm back. Something else shared. Ezra and I were both Midwestern Jews at Harvard, and as such, a bit matter out of place in an institution that was still then dominated by a sort of Brahmin Boston culture. We didn't have the East Coast Jewish culture either. We were dealt with politely, but with some consciousness of differentness. I found it easier in many ways to be a gaijin from Harvard in Japan than to be a Jew at Harvard in the late 1950s. I suspect Ezra enjoyed the special status of being a gaijin from Harvard in Japan, too. Both of us set down deep roots in Japan, quasi-familial ones, and our close relationships in the families. Amy's photographs, Steve's photographs really express that very well. Those close family relationships helped us to get deeper into their confidence. On one year, very special year, 1975, 1976, Ezra and Suzanne and Steve and Eve, I think David wasn't there, were in Tokyo, only about a 5-minute bus ride from where I was living with my daughter and a friend. And Eve and my daughter, Jen, were both studying at the Nishimachi school together. We were all together a good bit then, and Suzanne and I visited potters in Moscow and joined women's groups, and the kids hung out together. It was a great luxury as a graduate student doing my fieldwork to have my advisor a few blocks away. I learned to pay more attention and to take nothing for granted, to be a deep participant, and to hold formal interviews on the one hand and take observations on subways at the other. I was a very meticulous note taker. The 2 books and their authors were still with me, now both of them real people, real advisors. When I found myself not writing everything down, Ron encouraged me by saying, okay, now you're really in Japan, you're not writing everything down. When in the middle of research and interviewing, my data went off course, Ezra said, he cheered, saying, you're letting the material tell you what to do, not the other way around. It's a good sign when you notice there's a different story. I want to echo Amy's observations of Suzanne's work, both in Japan's new middle class and her own work with women in clinical settings in Japan, which she traced psychological issues in family contexts. And she was the one who really maintained close touch with the Mamachi families. She noted things about them that may not have made it into the text, such as the fact, I believe this is true, that all of the men were mukoyoshi, married in sons-in-laws. Though most were in nuclear families, so the effect might not have been so marked. Her work later in the book and other work that Amy has described showed indeed that Suzanne had her own Japan. Ezra was not a shy researcher, but I was. He always said there's no one you can't learn something from, whether you're in a supermarket queue or an airport lounge. I've heard Steve talk about this practice as somewhat embarrassing to his family in such situations. Ezra was also a living example of the Japanese dictum that it is hard work and not some inborn trait that will get you where you need to go. I do suspect, however, that he must have had a language gene in addition to the highly productive labor he committed daily to language practice, both in Chinese and in Japanese. I think I was in my late 60s when he finally said, I think your Japanese has really improved, Corky. And it made me realize how hard Ez was on himself and how hard he worked that he could finally commend me. I took it as praise and also as an injunction to work even harder. I also realized that once a graduate student, always a graduate student. The most enduring and generous gift Ezra offered was the establishment of a solidarity group, a group of his graduate students that persists to this day. And I think at least one is in the audience tonight. He told us that what we needed most was each other. And we are still in touch. We met almost constantly with Ezra, most of the time when he wasn't or we weren't in Asia. He knew the life of a graduate student can be lonely, and the mutual support we could offer each other under his guidance would be important. Being a student of Ezra's was sometimes complicated. During the trade war, he and I, by extension, were called apologists for Japan and reviled in the press. I remember a review of my first Japan book on schools, reviewed by Ian Baruma in the New York Review of Books, in which he said, all you have to do is look at the book jacket blurb by Ezra Vogel to know that this is just another volume from the Harvard School of Japan as #1. Well, I took that as praise, and Ezra and I had a good laugh over it. I think I should probably curtail some of my other remarks on both the book and the the persistence of Ezra's work in my life. But to say that when my work took a turn, partly because the disciplines changed and admitted food anthropology to be a legitimate exercise, Ezra did not lose the faith. Although he was not as interested in food professionally as I was, my home base in Japan shifted a bit. In those years between undergraduate and graduate school, I had been a professional food person and cookbook writer, et cetera. But when I entered sociology back then in the early 70s, one of my advisors said, take it all off your CV or you'll never get an academic job. It makes you look like a woman. That was a quote. Something many of us dealt with in graduate school then, that looking like a woman thing, even without the food. But much later, after I got tenure, and when anthropology and other disciplines allowed food studies to be legitimate and not just called female, I put it all back on the CV. So I am now doing a study of Japanese food workers, learning again to take notes as I did as a graduate student, and that almost anything could count and turn your storyline in a different direction. In the next year or so, I have a corporate ethnography of Suntory to do. After all, the current CEO is a Harvard man. I suspect whiskey was not Ezra's favorite, but I still think he would approve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor White. Now, I'd like to move on to the second comment from Professor Allison Alexy.
Thank you very much. Just give me a second, I'll share my screen. So thank you all. It's such an honor to be here, to be part of this panel. I see so many friendly names and people in the participants list, and I'm so grateful that you're all here. I know we're all perhaps a little burned out of Zoom, so I'm really impressed and grateful for your commitment and your energy at various times of the morning and night, as far as I can tell, right? I think we're all around the world. So let me begin by expressing my gratitude to be included in this panel, and especially to Professor Junko Habu and Sumi Sawada Hadler for their work organizing this event. It is truly my honor to be here and to be able to add my voice to the broad chorus reflecting on Professor Vogel's lasting legacy in the academy, in Japanese studies, and in popular interest in East Asian studies. In some ways, my personal connections with Professor Vogel are less direct or substantial than what we have heard from the previous two speakers. Although I was able to learn from Professor Vogel at a few public talks and conference panels over the years, I was not a student of his and actually began graduate school just after he retired. However, even given this relative distance, Professor Vogel's scholarship was fundamental to my training in cultural anthropology, so much that the legacies continue to be clear in my research and writing. In this way, I can imagine my connection with Professor Vogel's work and his legacy might be perhaps a little bit more typical. Although I did not directly train with him, his scholarship fundamentally shaped and continues to shape my research. At the same time that the patterns and norms he identified in Japan's new middle class continue to shape the lives, choices, and ideologies of the people with whom I conduct research. At another level, more abstract but no less real, I understand that the job I currently hold would be less likely, if not impossible, without the decades of work Professor Vogel put in creating Japanese studies as a viable and vital field within the American Academy and public consciousness. Particularly at a public institution in the state of Michigan, where there are twinned histories of the American auto industry and anti-Asian racism and violence, I do not take the existence of Japanese studies for granted as a discipline. In my reflections today, I'd like to discuss the foundational support and ongoing inspiration I find in Professor Vogel's work, particularly Japan's new middle class, and particularly as a scholar whose research interests diverge somewhat from his. Broadly speaking, my research explores gender, family, and law in contemporary Japan, and my first book examines divorce in the early 2000s. Thanks to the Tome program and to the University of Chicago Press, it is available as a free version through open access. So if you're interested and would like to download it, please check it out. As you might know, the divorce rate at that point suggested, as it does now, that about 1/3 of marriages would eventually end in dissolution, a number that was inconsistently increasing, but remained dwarfed by the divorce rate during the early years of Meiji. When I began my research in Tokyo in 2005, it took me longer than it should have to realize that the urgency with which people discussed divorce was not matched by an increase in the divorce rate. Even though divorce seemed to be a topic of conversation almost everywhere I turned, either as a threatening source of anxiety or a utopic fantasy, this attention was not prompted by a significantly rapid rise in the divorce rate. Instead, two things were happening. First, who requested divorces in these had shifted. Compared to previous moments in the post-war era, when men were more likely to request divorces and women were more likely to work to refuse them, by 2005, it felt like the gendered ratio had flipped. So divorce when I was doing my research was something that everyone seemed to think women wanted and men were working to refuse. Many men with whom I conducted research, especially men in their 60s or older, told me about how they felt nervous that their wives might suddenly leave them. Their reasons represented the second major shift. People told me that whereas acceptable or recognizable reasons for divorce in earlier moments, especially for women, were more likely to be domestic violence or abuse, or the husband wanting to start a family with another person, by the mid-2000s, acceptable and recognizable explanations for divorce had shifted to include leaving marriages that people of any gender found unfulfilling or damaging to their identities or sense of self. When I asked about the specific elements of a marriage that they understood or managed to be damaging to them, a critical reflection on what I call styles of intimacy, many people had clear negative examples at their fingertips to describe the kinds of marriages they did not want, that stifled their sense of self or that worried them. Lucky for me, I also had a deep knowledge of those marriages as a result of the rich, detailed, and memorable examples in Japan's new middle class. As I'm sure you remember, the third section of the book describes the continued and complicated influence of EA within families, the gender division of labor within and outside the household, and patterns of what people judge to be successful or good marriages. Vogel writes, although in comparison to other families, salaried families, i.e. the families of salarymen, are in the forefront of breaking down the pattern of the husband abstaining from household work, the amount of change has been infinitesimal. Some, quote, modern mamachi husbands occasionally look after the children or put up their own bedding. And a few have swept the yard, run the electric sweeper, or run a few errands. But very few have ever assisted their wives in dusting, cleaning, preparing food, setting or clearing the table, or doing the dishes. And it is unthinkable for a husband to assist in serving guests. Many husbands are still unable to prepare their own meals in their wives' absence, and a few will still go without tea if their wives are away. When I conducted research with men and women who were considering divorce or recovering after one, many told me that this type of marriage was precisely what they didn't want, that such a deeply gendered division of labor felt problematic. No matter how much they loved their parents or their grandparents, they just couldn't mirror the forms and shapes of those marriages. I hope you can understand how powerful it was for me as a white American learning in and writing about Japan to have the rich ethnographic time capsule that is Japan's new middle class. The book enabled me to immediately recognize styles of intimacy that occurred between spouses I had never met, in private spaces that existed decades before I was born, and almost 50 years before I began my research. Much has already been said here in today's panel and elsewhere about Professor Vogel's prescient abilities to identify and research the next globally important topic. When he last spoke at the University of Michigan in 2014, Professor Vogel told a funny story about how a Harvard business student once had apparently recognized his ability to anticipate global attention and sought to get ahead of the market by asking him what region he next planned to research. His topical and regional prescience is obviously true, but I would also like to add my appreciation for his ability to do the opposite, to identify, describe, and analyze social dynamics that would come to remain vitally important decades later. It is not lost on me that at the same time I was grateful as a researcher for his time capsule description of marital norms in 1958, my Japanese interlocutors in 2005 wanted to talk about almost exactly the same topics Professor Vogel highlights as central in Japan's new middle class. He was anticipating not only the next important topic or region, but also the topics that would remain important. This feels like the textbook definition of legacy. In anthropological fashion, Professor Vogel's work also emphasizes the ways in which families continue to matter, even in so-called modern societies, where some social theorists had predicted a lessening of kin ties and influence. We all know the common, if contested, rhetoric that companies use to extract more loyalty and labor from employees by designating them family, perhaps if not, maybe not a happy family. Last year, when I was teaching about political economies linking Japanese families with the labor market and asked students to reflect on the company as family rhetoric, one clever and kind of world-weary student reflected on a horrible job she had had, saying, quote, "When your boss starts talking about how you're all family, you know they're going to ask you to do something awful." She's right. I think it was at Payless, FYI. For our purposes here, I think it's important to point out that my undergraduate students' sense of what counts as something awful in employment seems to have shifted in the years I've been teaching. Around 2010, very few students in my classes would express any interest in the salaryman lifestyle. And I found myself pushing them to understand why thoughtful, caring, and rational people might have found it to be a reasonable, if not ideal, choice in, say, the 1970s. When I taught the same class last year, I noticed a real flip, and the majority of students in my class, who are largely but not entirely American, articulated a preference for the predictability and regularity available to salarymen. In a class on Japanese culture and society pushed onto Zoom because of a global pandemic, after waves of structural adjustment to employment opportunities, predictable, if slightly boring employment as a salaryman feels closer to ideal for at least some students. To be fair, in the same class, I had a student tell me that he couldn't understand the film Train Man, released in 2005, because it was confusingly old, as demonstrated through, and I quote, "the phones and stuff." I felt really old that day. If filmic representations of technology prove to be alienating for at least some viewers or students, this panel has been a joyous and energizing opportunity for me to reflect on the legacies I see and feel in Professor Vogel's work in my own, the legacies of the trends he so carefully identified in Japanese society, and the legacies of his model of transnational and transregional scholarship. Especially for an anthropologist who leans into the stereotype and studies kinship, this is a wonderful lineage to even be tangentially related to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Allison. So now we are moving on to the question and answer session. Please put your questions on the chat section if you have any. And while we are waiting, I'll ask my first question. And I think what's really interesting to me is that growing up in the suburb of Japan in Yokohama in the 60s and the 70s, many of what's written in Japan's new middle class is very familiar to me, how people thought of modernization. And I think one of the issues that really struck me, and I think actually it became really apparent after I came to North America, that when I was in Japan, the general sense is Japan is still behind, Japan needs to be modernized, and really need to catch up, even in cities as well as in rural parts of Japan. And I think in rural parts of Japan, that is still the case in many parts of Japan. But my sense is the concept of modernization was so closely tied to the concept of democracy, which was also tied to the idea of equity. And the idea of being a salaryman was that everybody was working towards the idea of making about the same amount of money. And in the early mid-80s, many people in Japan said that, well, nobody in Japan is starved to death, and 90% of the Japanese are upper middle, which wasn't quite true. But when I went to Canada in 1988, I was shocked by the disparity between the rich and poor. And it was Canada, it wasn't even the United States. But Japan did change very quickly since then. And I think part of the mystery behind this is the concept of democracy that was brought into Japan was so closely tied to equity, but at the same time, it was so closely tied to the corporate economy, but people didn't really see that in the 60s and 70s. And by the time it became more apparent in the 80s and 90s, it was kind of too late. And I think, so my question is the concept of democracy in Japan, what do you think the role of the concept of democracy was in the 50s through to the 80s? And to what extent it was created by a small group of Americans who tried to implement democracy and modernization in their own understanding, as opposed to what's considered to be democracy in America and Canada. And I know that this is rather a big question, but if you can say a few words. Amy, since you talked about democracy, would you like to say a few words?
Okay. Well, your question is really interesting, and it's a big question, but I will just start by saying something that I think Bill Kelly has pointed out before. Maybe it's in his introduction to the third edition of the book, but that it's kind of, this is really kind of an aside, but it's interesting and noteworthy that Japan's new middle class, the body of the text, is really not about the company.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. I mean, of course, it's very much related to the set of concerns, but you know, it's about the community, and it sort of comes back to that point that Ezra himself made, that he really started with concerns about the family and kind of worked outward in this sort of Parsonian way. But I mean, the question that you're raising is really interesting. In the high growth era was, to me, very much about trade-offs. And it was, I mean, Andrew Gordon points this out in his work, in his book on modern Japanese history, that Japan in the 1960s and 70s was a very equal society. Of course, it wasn't perfectly equal. There were white collar workers, there were blue collar workers, but it was a relatively equal society. And the corporations had a lot to do with that. And they provided this incredible ticket to Social Security, but that came at a cost too. And, you know, it was really the fact that the more radical, aggressive labor unions had lost out in the immediate post-war period, that this kind of middle ground, this negotiation was reached, that, you know, employees of these large-scale firms would consent to, in a way, more subordinate roles within the firm.
Thank you, Amy. Mary and Allison, anything you want to add?
I just wanted to say quickly, thank you for such a great question. The two answers that spring to my mind are, first, about sort of democracy as a symbol and a metaphor. So I study family life and intimacy, and I heard people using both democracy as a concept and sort of feudalism, basically as stand-ins for different types of family norms and gender norms. And so saying things like, oh, he's very feudal. I'm sure we've all heard people say like, and it's funny. I mean, it can be funny, right? So that's the first thing is I see more of that kind of talk about what people seem to think democracy stands for as it relates in family lives. But the other thing I was thinking about was Jolene Thomas's excellent book, Faking Liberties, that I imagine many of us have already read, but I found it to be really transformative, at least for me, as I was thinking about democracy in Japan and the ways in which it, like the ironies and the contradictions about Americans sort of pretending democracy is more just and more equal and frankly less racist than it actually is in practice. So I just wanted to bring that into the conversation as well. But thank you so much for the excellent question.
I just wanted to say Amy's response and Allison's responses are really excellent on this point. I go back a little further when democracy was under attack as in Japan as an American demokurashi kind of thoughts about, that the lack of fit was emphasized and a much more radical sense of a social contract was espoused by the left when the early movements were taking off when I was there in the late 60s. So there were periods in which it was constantly being redefined. First, of course, in the Constitution, when the idea that America's little brother could be a kind of test case for the establishment of a democratic outpost of America, to the machinations trying to make various concepts fit social and cultural realities. So there were many iterations of and meanings even in the same era.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much. We have several comments, and there's one long comment. So I will read it. That's from Tom Gold. Bravo, great discussion. I really appreciated Amy's discussion of the Pearsonian AGIL framework and how Ezra applied and deviated from it. I don't have the book with me, but I think Canton under Communism also had a Pearsonian flavor. I realize this is a Japan panel, but I think it's important to acknowledge that Ezra's early work on China tried to capture many of the same details of social life, but in a society he could not enter. He based his early China ethnographies on interviews in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So any comments on this long comment?
Corky, did you discuss Canton under communism with Ezra or in your seminars? I read it much later in my life, like relatively recently.
Yeah. Actually, Tom was in that group. And, he's responsible for remembering. I found our notebooks from that ongoing years-long Kenkyukai, and I also found the questions that Ezra posed to his basic class on communist China, and the questions he posed to the undergraduates were absolutely fascinating. There was a lot more hope about what China had to offer. And I remember the main question, this is not to the point of the book itself, but his star question for that final examination was, what can Americans learn from China? And I saw that, later, as presaging, the lessons for America in Japan is number one. Ezra was ever hopeful.
That's really fascinating, actually, to hear that. And it reminds me of a really interesting conversation that I was having recently with Rick Dyke, who's also, well, I know that you and he go way back too, right? And he was one of Ezra's students. I'm not sure exactly how the generations line up, and I don't want to speculate, but
It's all the same.
okay. But he talked about how it's really interesting what you say about sort of Ezra floating out the possibility that China could also offer something to learn, because what Rick Dyke was kind of alerting me to is just the volatile atmosphere in the world and in Cambridge. I think Canton Under Communism came out in 67 or 69, actually. I don't know if anyone knows. So, I mean, Rick was saying that there were, Harvard, there was a lot of student activism and radicals and a lot of excitement about China. And, I think he just was walking this very delicate line in wanting to talk about development in China as both an exemplar, something that was impressive, but also something where, the government made a lot of mistakes. And, of course, the devastation of the Cultural Revolution and so forth. And I just had the feeling that it was just this kind of volatile mix. And there was a social critique there of looking for something different that many people felt communism could no longer fulfill, but I guess some people still did think so. And I just think it's really interesting to think about sort of how Japan was fitting into that mix as well. Was it fulfilling some place that was neither the United States nor China in some way? I don't know the answer to that question. But.
If I could just say very quickly, I was struck too that I imagine many of us for the last 2 years, especially, have been thinking about what does it mean to do research on a place where you can't go, especially if you can't go much of anywhere, right? So I haven't been into Japan for almost 2 years, I think now, and it feels bad and strange. This is a very small problem. It's not even quite a problem, but I just wanted to say that, it's always really interesting and inspiring to think about people who were able to produce real sociological, anthropological insights when they weren't actually able to get to a place. So hopefully I will be able to go to Japan soon. We will all be able to travel safely, but I just wanted to sort of say that it resonates a bit with me differently at this moment.
Thank you. There are two comments from one from David Vogel. Canton Under Communism was published in 1969, and from Tom Gold, I came to Harvard in fall 1973. Ezra had just returned from his first trip to China and was very upbeat, as Koki noted. He had to be persuaded to teach a grad seminar on Japan. And his focus had shifted to China. That was also the era of dependency theory, world system theory, very anti-Pearsonian. Thank you. And there's also a question from Richard Katz. I was struck by Allison's comments on the evolution of the reasons for divorce. I think Ezra quotes Japan in one moment of time, but when I asked 20-ish Tokyo women whether they are more like their grandmothers or their counterparts in New York in terms of hopes, dreams, frustrations, they all say like their New York counterparts. Allison and Amy, can you comment on the generational change in terms of Ezra's work and modernization theory?
Allison, you go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So thank you so much for being here and for this really smart and thoughtful question. My first answer is, yeah, generational change is absolutely real, but is also something that people really comment on and are really, I think, apt, or they regularly sort of bring up in conversation. So this is a bit of a generalization, but it was true in the course of my fieldwork and my research that people either wanted the marriage that their parents had or absolutely did not want the marriage that their parents had. Like that was, or their grandparents or other family members. Like those are really significant points to compare, to imagine, to fantasize, right? To sort of plan your future and say, okay, well, I saw what didn't work for my parents, and so therefore I will not do, or therefore I will do. So that doesn't quite answer your question, but in terms of people really noticing generational difference, or like hoping for generational difference, I hear that a lot. And frankly, I hear that in other places too. It's not just a Japanese thing. The other example I was thinking of was debates, sort of contemporary debates about what's best for children, especially around divorce and family tension or family conflict or family violence. So there's some people who think that in the US as well, that any divorce is always going to be the worst option for children, especially maybe children of a certain age. And there are other people who believe that living in a family with a lot of conflict is actually the worst thing for children. So as a generational difference, I think that is a shift that I think we're in the middle of, frankly, in Japan, I mean, and there seems to be more people now arguing that it's actually better for the children if parents get divorced, if they're not getting along. So that's not exactly the example you use, but that's what your comment made me think of. So thank you again.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess I would just add that, I mean, we know that Japanese women are getting married later. When you look at the data on that, it's really striking. If you compare, for example, number of unmarried women between the ages of, say, 25 and 30 or 30 and 35, those two curves have gone up dramatically since something like the late 1980s. So they are behaving more like their New York counterparts in that way. And I suppose like women in affluent countries, and they're having fewer children, or they're not getting married. And that's been kind of a really interesting, I think, development that perhaps people didn't anticipate. So in that sense, yes, but I think perhaps the reason why well, we don't know, but one could speculate that the reason why they're declining to get married is that so many other things remain the same, and namely the kinds of things that Allison is pointing to this evening, and also in her book, is this kind of unyielding division of labor within the home, which Ezra and Suzanne originally pointed out in 1958. So I think there are shifts and continuities.
I think also that, the never married people have gone way up in both for men and women. I think the numbers are in the 20% of people over 50, is that correct? Who have never been married and thus are not obviously reproducing. Marriage and reproduction mostly going together. So I think, I mean, there's all kinds of speculation and all kinds of efforts just below a kind of pro-natalist policy to correct this apparent crisis of non-reproduction. So I think actually what's really interesting are what the efforts are to get women to have babies. Of course, it's always couched as, women are having the babies. So, and I think that's right, that it is the lack of change in the culture of family labor or roles. You can have a 50-50 marriage in Japan, they say, until the baby is born. And that everything shifts.
Well, thank you very much. I wish we could continue our conversation for the next 1 hour, but I know that on the East Coast, especially, it's very late, and some of the people actually, I think, even logging in from the European side. So I think I'd like to thank our panelists for the really exciting and thoughtful presentations and active discussions. I learned a lot, and it made me think of many issues that we could further pursue. And I think rereading the Japan's New Middle Class made me realize how many things are written in that book that I didn't notice previously.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can have another opportunity to continue our discussion sometime in the future. And I'd like to thank our panelists again for their excellent presentations.